I first read Hermann Hesse's novel Demian in 1970. It was originally published in German in 1919, just after World War I had ended. Hesse's writing was very popular when I was in high school. Most students read his novel Siddhartha, about a manifestation or avatar of the Buddha. Others read Steppenwolf and Magister Ludi. A few, like myself, read Narcissus and Goldmund, which echoes themes found in Demian. We learned that he'd won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1946. I still remember the day in early 1970, sometime before March, when my high school friend Peter Kahn's mother, Lisa Kahn, who was then a poet and professor at Texas Southern University, was showing me some prints of Hermann Hesse's illustrations in their hallway, and gazing at me said, "I like to think you and Peter are like Max and Sinclair in Hesse's novel Demian. You should read it." I did read it, shortly thereafter, in an English translation. I remember that when Peter and I next traveled to his family's farm from Houston, where we lived, to Round Top, Texas, we talked about Demian. I was surprised when he told me that he wasn't so impressed by the novel, certainly not as much as his mother. On the other hand, I, like his mother, thought the novel very powerful and loved it. For me, it was life-changing. For those of you who have not read Demian, and for those of you who have, but for whom it's been a long time, the narrative focuses on a young German man named Sinclair who's growing from boyhood to young adulthood. At school, he meets a very unusual, mysterious boy named Max Demian. They become close friends. Eventually, Sinclair meets Frau Eva, Demian's mother, and her associates. The novel culminates with the onset of World War I. The name Demian does not refer here to a demon, but instead to the ancient Greek concept of daemon, a figure that simultaneously represents a demigod, one's conscience, and the soul. So how was this novel life-changing? I suppose the first thing that comes to me is a quote from the novel. "I wanted only to live in accord with the promptings which came from my true self. Why was that so very difficult?" I remember that when I first read this at 16, I thought to myself, I'm finding it very difficult at the moment to live in accord with the promptings from my true self. In fact, I felt like every day I was putting on a mask, wearing a costume, not being myself, not expressing my thoughts. How could I begin to let my true self emerge? In the novel, Sinclair speaks of realizing that for him there exists two worlds. The first, the one governed by his parents and by Christian morals, he names the world of day. This is the world in which he lives, in which he's expected to live. It is a world of duty, guilt, and confession. The other world, which he names the world of night, is a realm inhabited by bohemians, artists, working-class folk, persons with morals that his parents and the church would consider loose, ghost stories, and mysterious things. At first, and for some time thereafter, the world of night, for him, is a world fraught with danger, in the form of a young man named Franz Kromer, a thief and a blackmailer who bullies Sinclair. I could also deeply relate to the experience of bullying, having been bullied by other males at school since very young childhood as a sissy. But the realm of night is also one of mystery, of wonder. If he could just rid himself of the bully, how will he be able to do this? How would I? Sinclair gradually begins to feel more and more that he resents being trapped within this duality of day and night, and finally that the world of day in which he's been forced to live is, in his words, a sham, that it's filled with hypocrisy, But how can he escape, move beyond this duality? And how could I? Sinclair's world begins to open up when he meets a new boy, a mysterious boy at school named Max Demian. By the way, Demian's surname has nothing to do with the Demian of the Omen, if any of you are familiar with this film, except that it's most probably an attempt to demonize the Demian of Hesse's novel. About all he knows of Max is that he's allegedly the son of a well-to-do widow. Sinclair writes of Max, quote, I kept glancing towards Demian, whose face held a peculiar fascination for me. I could not help looking at him. His manner and bearing was that of a prince disguised among farm boys. Sinclair is delighted when Max asks him, shall we walk together for a while? One of the first things that fascinates Sinclair about Max is his challenging of their religious teacher in regard to the biblical story of Cain and Abel. This reminded me of my first challenge to a Sunday school teacher when I was about 5 or 6. When she told us the story of Noah's Ark, I raised my hand afterwards and told her that I preferred the tale of Jason and the Argonauts. She stared at me with fury in her eyes and exclaimed, the story of Noah's Ark is true. The story of Jason and the Argonauts is a lie. When I replied that I really didn't believe the story of animals parading 2 by 2 into the ark and didn't see why it was any truer than that of Jason, she kicked me out of the Sunday school class. Thus, I was intrigued with Max's turning the tale of Cain and Abel on its head. Wanting to further study his alternate reading, I went on to study the Gnostics, groups who mixed biblical knowledge with pagan theologies, particularly the Cainites, whom Sinclair's father warns him against, and others who suggested that Cain was not an evil person, but instead a good one, who refused to obey a totalitarian God, one who rejected his offering because it was vegetarian, instead of his brother Abel's carnivorous one. Moreover, Max also criticizes the Bible for honoring a God of life and then demonizing sexuality as sinful. Further still, Max bears the sign of Cain on his forehead, which might resemble a tree of life. Much later in the novel, when Sinclair turns 18, he realizes that he too bears the mark of Cain on his forehead. He realizes that both Max Demian and himself belong to the tribe of Cain. Max's questioning of the biblical narrative opens the door for Sinclair, as it did for me, to the possibility of there being more than one religion, and indeed more than one God. From 2 other characters in the novel, Dr. Follins, a professor, and Pistorius, a pianist, Sinclair learns of other deities and religions. The primary deity that Demian reveres is the Gnostic deity Abraxas. According to Dr. Follins, Abraxas represents the unity of godly and devilish elements. In this way, Abraxas evokes one of the primary things Sinclair has been searching for, a god, a way of living, professions, and perhaps a place, a realm beyond duality. Pistorius, for instance, loves music because he believes it exists beyond morality. That is, it's amoral. Hesse was inspired to write of his notion of someone, something, existing in a realm beyond dualism by the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, one of whose most well-known works is Beyond Good and Evil. This movement beyond duality develops a major theme of the novel, that of hybridity, the mixing or blending of opposites or others. In the novel, the god Abraxas manifests in the form of a sparrowhawk. Sinclair observes that the coat of arms in the arch above the doorway of Demian's house is that of a sparrowhawk. Once when they're separated, Sinclair finds a note from Max that connects Abraxas and the sparrowhawk. Quote, the bird fights its way out of the egg. The bird flies to God. That God's name is Abraxas. A young woman named Beatrice might be seen as a somewhat minor character in the novel, but she is in fact a character that exemplifies hybridity, moving beyond dualities. Although Sinclair never actually meets her, she becomes an ideal vision for him. He decides to paint her portrait. When he actually does, he begins to notice that he has given her, quote, a boyish face and a boyish figure. It was not the face of that girl, he relates. It looks more like a boy's face than a girl's. At the same time, she is goddess-like. Quote, she raised her image before me. She gave me access to a holy shrine. She transformed me into a worshiper in the temple. Combining these two notions, he continues, it resembled a kind of image of God or a holy mask, half male, half female. Although we learn this in a very subtle manner, as Sinclair paints the final brushstrokes on his painting, he realizes that he has simultaneously painted Beatrice, Demian, Abraxas, and someone he has yet to meet. In this way, Sinclair's portrait of Beatrice links androgyny and hybridity. The person he has yet to meet is Damian's mother. I'll never forget first reading about Max Damian's mother, Frau Eva, or Mother Eve. She represents for Sinclair a woman who is neither an innocent girl nor a mother like his own, or a housewife who conforms to structures set upon her by her patriarchal culture. She is neither a prostitute, nor is she an ideal vision like Beatrice. She is flesh and blood. She is described as a, quote, tall, almost masculine woman who resembles her son, beautiful and alluring, all but unapproachable. Frau Eva is a wisdom giver, a goddess embodied in physical form. As Sinclair says to Max, quote, she is like a universal mother. Sinclair is both spiritually and physically drawn to her, but she avoids him physically until one day, as the novel draws to a close, she kisses him on the mouth. When I first read of her, she reminded me not of my mother, nor of any adolescent young woman I knew, but of my favorite teacher, Shirley Wiley. Like Frau Eva, Wiley was a wealthy, mysterious, beautiful adult woman who shared her wisdom with her students. She taught humanities, including leading myself, as Sinclair longs to achieve, to increasingly, quote, live in accord with the promptings which came from my true self. In the home of Max and Frau Eva, Sinclair comes to know a different sort of family that may include, but that is not only defined by the members of one's biological family. That is, he comes to recognize the existence of a spiritual family, a family of fellow travelers or kindred spirits. The family of Frau Eva and Max, of which Sinclair becomes a part, worships Abraxas, God that exists beyond good and evil, but also embraces, quote, astrologers and Kabbalists, practitioners of Jewish mysticism, disciples of Tolstoy, that is, pantheists who believe that nature and God are at one, devotees of Indian asceticism, roughly Hindu meditation, vegetarians, Buddhists, and those seeking other gods. Some believe in reincarnation. Some, like Max, practice psychic thought reading and trance. Frau Eva's home is based on the community of Monte Verita, also called Ascona, a utopian community in Switzerland where Hesse and many other well-known writers, artists, and others gathered in the early 1900s. As a teenager and young adult, inspired by my reading of Demian, I commenced on an in-depth exploration of other religions and spiritual traditions, including Buddhism, Hinduism, Egyptian and Greek paganism, African and indigenous American traditions, and witchcraft, or Wicca. Ultimately, however, the primary principle that Max Demian, Frau Eva, and their spiritual family follows returns us to some of my first remarks. This is belief that beyond all the esoteric or occult knowledge we may acquire, it is the truth, the teachings that we come to know within ourselves that are most significant. As Sinclair says it, quote, I have ceased to question stars and books. Each of us strives towards his own destiny. Each of us interprets himself to himself alone. This home is not, however, completely cut off from the outside world, but instead the dwellers live in the midst of it, only on an entirely different plane, separated not by a physical boundary, but by way of, quote, another mode of vision. I learned from this novel that even when one must live in a world governed by oppressive rules, theologies, and such, one can nevertheless learn to separate oneself from it by cultivating, quote, another mode of vision, a, quote, more and more complete state of awareness. Also in regard to finding a family, a home, spiritual or otherwise, Frau Eva offers Sinclair another powerful piece of wisdom. One never reaches home, she tells him, but where paths that have affinity for each other intersect, then that place looks like home for a time. I now want to return to the friendship of Sinclair and Max Demian. Sinclair remarks, quote, perhaps he was handsome. I became preoccupied with Max Demian. There seemed to be a bond between us. Sinclair provides us with a fascinating portrait of Max. Quote, I saw Demian's face, and I not only noticed that it was not a boy's face, but a man's. I also felt or saw that it was not entirely the face of a man either, but had something feminine about it. At the same time, his face struck me as neither old nor young, but somehow 1,000 years old, bearing the scars of an entirely different history than we know. Animals could look like that. In another place, he extends this portrait by describing Demian as, quote, beautiful and cold, dead yet secretly filled with fabulous life. His portrait of Demian once more emphasizes the theme of moving beyond dualities, which is linked to that of androgyny, but also extends beyond it. It's a vision of hybridity, of gender, of age, of species, even of time and space, and beyond life and death. In first reading this, I thought of my own attraction to androgynous persons, individuals who seem to defy traditional boundaries of gender, and of my desire to cultivate androgyny within myself, brought on perhaps in part by the role of Peter Pan during my childhood, as it was played by Mary Martin and later other women. As I left high school for college, performers like David Bowie dramatically cultivated androgyny. For me, at that time, androgyny was linked to my attraction to other male youth, as well as to athletic, even tough, female friends. At some point, Sinclair says of Max, I suffered gladly at Demian's hands, with a feeling compounded as much by ecstasy as of fear. I could definitely understand Sinclair's fascination with Max, with his joy on being asked to walk with Max for a time. I had felt that way toward several other boys, yearned to grow closer to them. I understood on a deep level that theirs was not to be an ordinary friendship. I also understood, however, the suffering and fear that Sinclair describes. The fear, on the one hand, that one will be rejected, on the other, that confessing one's attraction to another male might bring rejection, mockery, bullying, and such. The suffering that comes when one is forbidden that which the one whom one desires, or that comes when one must be separated from someone they care deeply about. Sinclair says of Max Demian that he was, quote, aware of a certain spiritual affinity that eventually was, quote, translated into physical closeness. I loved the scent of fresh soap emanating from the nape of his neck. This attraction is later described in the novel as a, quote, struggle with a drive that is stronger than any other, and which is considered forbidden. The Greeks, quote, elevated this drive, made it divine, and celebrated it in great feasts. For any of you who think I might be seeking to transform a bromance into a romance, I would suggest that the lines between close friendship and love are often not as nearly clearly drawn as some would like, and that by the novel's end it is clear that whatever line there might have been is broken. I would also point toward Hesse's role as an outspoken ally of the early gay rights movement, which was emerging in Germany and elsewhere at the end of the 19th century. In 1897, Magnus Hirschfeld, a gay Jewish scholar, founded the Scientific Humanitarian Committee in Germany. He drew up a petition campaigning for the civil rights of those we now refer to as LGBTQ persons that called for the, quote, removal of homosexual acts from criminal status, quote. Among the signers of this petition were the writers Thomas Mann, Rainer Maria Rilke, Emil Zola, and Leo Tolstoy, the artist Kathy Kollwitz, the philosopher Martin Buber, the physicist Albert Einstein, and Hermann Hesse. Hesse was incidentally a good friend of Thomas Mann, who wrote Death in Venice, a novel of same-sex love. This early LGBTQ rights movement and its literature were destroyed by the Nazis, who also put around 10,000 gay and bisexual men forced to wear a pink triangle badge to death in concentration camps under the German law, paragraph 175. When he is separated from Max for a time, Sinclair does not accompany, quote, his friends when they visit women. Instead, he is, quote, alone, filled with intense longing for love. How I longed for Demian. As the novel Demian culminates, World War I is beginning. As I read this the first time, it struck me more powerfully than it might have at another time, because the U.S. was fighting a war in Vietnam, its army full of young men who were being drafted, with many wishing to do so, and many, many more forced into the military against their will. I myself filed for conscientious objector. Hesse himself was a pacifist. We're told of a vision in which a goddess appears above a city under attack. It seems that she is taking the suffering and dying into herself, as into a cave, to protect them. Quote, into their midst stepped a mighty godlike figure, as huge as a mountain range, with sparkling stars in her hair, bearing the features of Frau Eva. The goddess cowered on the ground, the mark luminous on her forehead. From her forehead sprang stars that leapt in marvelous arches across the black sky. Under this overarching canopy that is Frau Eva, a canopy resembling that formed by the Egyptian goddess Nut spanning the night sky, lie two soldiers, Sinclair and Max Damian. Together they form a kind of trinity, except that this trinity is not comprised of a Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, but of a mother goddess, her son, and her adopted son. This trinity is also found in the ancient epic of Gilgamesh, a Mesopotamian text written down almost 4,000 years ago, in which Ninsun, the mother of Gilgamesh, who is a goddess, adopts Gilgamesh's beloved friend Enkidu as her own son in what is clearly a ceremony of union for the two men. This trinity was beautifully portrayed by William A. Edwards on the cover of the translation of Demian that I purchased, which my present colleague, Amani Wazwaz, also remembers fondly. In psychological terms, this trinity responds to certain archetypes, overarching types, that Hesse drew upon from the psychological theory of Carl Gustav Jung. These are the anima, the archetypal feminine, manifested in the novel by Frau Eva, and to a lesser extent by Beatrice, and the double or twins archetype, which Jung would leave to Mitchell Walker and later Jungians to clearly establish, as manifested by Max Demian and Sinclair. I resonated with this trinity in high school because my humanities teacher, Shirley Wiley, acknowledged and approved of my love for other males. I'll never forget the afternoon I was helping her in the classroom, and while putting on her lipstick, she gazed at me and said, "You know, Randy, Leonardo da Vinci loved men." At that time, 3 male friends and I manifested the archetype of the double or twins. One was Peter. Our relationship remained platonic. The use of this term, of course, is ironic, or else most often used inappropriately, since Plato loved Agathon in the flesh. The second and third of the young men and I moved beyond the platonic in our friendship into love, breaking the dualistic boundary of friendship and intimate love. With the second of these young men, I took on the role of Max Damian. In the other, I was Sinclair. The second of those relationships ended with the young man's leaving me for a woman. The third ended for other reasons. We have recently reconnected as friends. Sinclair tells us that as they lay there on the battlefield, Damian, quote, gazed into my eyes for what seemed like an endless time. He then tells him that he must go away. "If you call me," Max tells Sinclair, "I won't come crudely, on horseback or by train. You'll have to listen within yourself. Then you will notice that I'm within you." Then Max bends over and, saying that it's from Frau Eva, kisses Sinclair on the lips and vanishes. Sinclair never really gets over the physical disappearance of Damian, but he tells him that when he gazes into the, quote, dark mirror, he senses that he and Max Damian have become one. Thus ends the novel. For the reasons I've described, I was determined when I believed that I would become a filmmaker to make a film of the novel before much time had passed. I recently learned that both my friend Peter and his mother have passed away. Peter died in 2018. I had lost contact with him for many years. I learned that he had died very suddenly and had left behind a wife and children. I would only see him once after our brief discussion about Damian. A month or so after we spoke of the novel, his father, a professor at a university in Houston, a German Jewish man who'd escaped the Nazis only to be accused by colleagues of being a communist, took his own life. I still recall the friendship I shared with Peter and his mother, and I continue to be very grateful to Lisa Kahn for encouraging me to read Demian.